Hi, everybody. I'm going to switch things up a little bit. I actually had a whole talk about the cognitive science behind narrative change. And then I got outside and it was like gray out. And I realized it was 9:30. Someone was up till 3 o'clock in the morning. And I realized that I'm not going to do that. If you want, I'll give you the talk later and you can find out about the cognitive science behind narrative change and why it actually is based in fact. But I want to do something different. As Joanna pointed out, I'm the co-founder of something called the Center for Artistic Activism. And we work around the globe on a whole range of issues and have for the past 15 years. My own activism goes back to one neighborhood over, the East Village, where I was a community organizer in the 1990s. But for the past 15 years, we've been working, I think we're about in 25 different countries on about a couple dozen issues, doing everything. I wrote some of this down. Been working with environmentalists in Jakarta and Washington, D.C., doing anti-corruption work with activists in the Western Balkans and in West Africa, working on sex workers' rights in South Africa and in Western Europe, trans rights in Eastern Europe, rights of migrants in Texas, and working on Scottish independence, which was kind of and also voting rights in the United States for the past couple of years, and that's just a kind of a smattering of what we do. But we start our workshops all with the same sort of question. We ask people to introduce themselves, what organization they're from, what campaigns they may have been working on, but then we ask them what made them step off the curb. And what I mean by stepping off the curb is it's something that, as a young activist, I was told, well, you got to get people to step off the curb. And we meant it quite literally. How do you get people to step off the sidewalk and into the street for your protest? But we also meant it in a much larger sense, which is how do you get people to move from a state of indifference to a state of action and commitment? And what's nice about being in this room is everybody has stepped off the curb. And the people I work with, everybody has stepped off the curb. But I'm most interested in why. What happened? Okay? So I want you to just think for a moment. What made you an advocate? Was there a moment when you were growing up? Maybe it was a person. I don't know what it is. I've done this thousands of times and come up with 1,000 different answers. But think about it for a second. What made you step off the curb and want to become an advocate for human rights? All right? Can I get a couple volunteers that are willing to talk about what made them step off the curb? Yeah.
Hi, my name is Tara Campbell, and I'm from Dayton, Ohio. So initially, I've always worked in housing as a profession and as an auditor. And so when I would go into the different spaces and look at places and the conditions of homes, there was only so much I can do under my current employer. So I wanted to make sure that I could do more. And so that is actually what led me to understand that advocacy was where I needed to go. So I started to look around, and it took me a while to really find my niche. But when I looked at it, I just showed up to a meeting at the library one day, and then it was around human rights, and they got to talking about housing and all of the different things. And at that point, I had no idea what human rights was really about. And so as it progressed and they were actually starting the movement in Dayton, I started to listen and learn more and got really interested in what does that look like for me, my family, and actually my community. And so I've been at it ever since. Thank you. Okay.
Nazi the house.
What do you mean by the homes? Like, what? Can you give a little more description?
Sure. So when you look at different conditions, it could be the conditions of where the landlord has allowed an individual to live in a dilapidated home, or it could be the conditions of the outside, or even just from the standpoint of how the landlord may have been treating the actual tenant. So when I'm actually doing the audit, I'm actually still looking at them as a member, how they're interacting with the tenant, the conditions, just the whole well round of actually being a tenant in affordable housing. And so there's all of those components that I saw that was like, what do you mean that you didn't accept the rent because you don't like them? Those types of things. Or what do you mean they're standing here and you didn't respond to their heat? And they're telling me when I get there, well, I've been without heat for 2 days. That's not a good thing.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
Sure.
Can I get someone else? Yeah.
I'm Natasha from Nepal. What made me an advocate was I grew up as a stateless person in Nepal. Nepal is a fairly new country. We saw the fall of our monarchy and a Maoist revolution, but because our constitution was written in a very ad hoc way, a lot of ethnic minorities were left off the constitution. And growing up without documents where you can't access healthcare or travel or get basic rights, it makes you invisible. And I think once I was able to get my passport, I realized how many more populations around the world are stateless. Working with Tibetans, working with the Rohingya populations, I think that's how I became an advocate.
Great.
Yeah.
Hold on. You had lots of people around you who also grew up stateless. What was it about the experience for you that said, no, I'm going to do something about this, as opposed to what most people do, which is like, this is terrible, and I'm just going to take care of myself, I'm going to take care of my family, and so on and so forth.
I think for me, it was just the abject helplessness of just feeling like no matter how skilled you are, there is nothing you can do about it just because somebody deems you not appropriate enough for a document. But I think the strength came from understanding that you're not alone, right? That there is power in going and advocating for yourself. Because I would go to meet ministers, I would go to advocate for myself. I was talking to lawyers all the time. And it just made me realize that you do need to do whatever you can. And once you have agents, you need to help others to get their documents.
Great. Thank you so much. One more?
So I think, look, when I think back of this question, I know that the growing up in Egypt and constantly seeing on the news what's happening in Palestine always made me think of a sense of great injustice and made me feel that I was, as a kid, like a 10-year-old when the Intifada was happening, I had a lot of privilege and I didn't know what to do about that. And then going into university, I studied law, and by 2011, the Arab Springs happened, and there was a great sense of collective power for change that is possible. And that kind of made me tilt toward why focus on economic and social culture rights, for like their possibility for redistributive justice, and also that they seem very connected to everyone's reality more than maybe specific larger scale atrocities that maybe not everyone can be directly related to or connected to.
Great. Thank you so much. Okay. Again, I've done this so many times, and you get so many different stories, right? But kind of some of the through lines in these stories are about experiences people have, okay? Often very personal experiences of outrage, disgust, experiences of helplessness, and also solidarity, experiences of seeing injustice, but also understanding one's privilege and wanting to do something about this, right? And again, the different conditions, different contexts change the tenor of the stories, but in some ways, there's some similarities. I'd love to go around with everybody and hear their stories. We obviously don't have time, so I'm going to do a little cheat sheet. Just raise your hand if this is the thing that made you an advocate? Reading a white paper on human rights. No one. Okay. Okay, wait. Okay. Let's try again. Someone came up and asked you to sign a petition for human rights. No. Okay. We'll get better. Okay. How about you got an email blast about a particular atrocity? No. Okay. You saw a press conference? You watched a webinar? I don't know, scanned an Instagram reel, got a tweet. I'm being unkind, but I'm being unkind to myself. When I was an organizer, this is how I reached out to people. This is what we did, right? And there's nothing wrong with any of these things, right? But it is not the spark which made me become an activist. For me, I grew up in an activist family. My dad was a civil rights worker. And then I discovered punk rock, which gave me sort of a voice of my own to articulate my political rage. No one I know has ever actually been turned into an activist by reading a white paper or receiving a tweet. Yet that is what we do as advocates. It's what I used to do as an activist. So there's a big mismatch about how we approach other people to get involved, to care, and what we often do in our practice to reach other people. So I could end it here and be really depressed, right? But there's actually a communication strategy that's been around for about 40,000 years, which actually works on this level of emotionality, experience, or what, since we're in a university, the fancy word, affective response. And that communication strategy is art. That is we actually can't reproduce for other people the experiences they have in their lives that made them become an advocate. But what we can do is we can tap in and recreate the sort of affective states that lead people towards activism. And that is why I got interested in art. I don't really care much about art, to be honest. I'm kind of I like art, don't get me wrong, okay? But I got into art through activism, right? I got into art because I was a community organizer in the Lower East Side, and the East Village, which was at that time kind of pre-gentrification, was full of artists. I guess they're the first wave of gentrifiers. After they got gentrified out. And so when we do community organizing, we were organizing amongst artists, and when I would say, let's do a press conference, a choreographer would stand up and say, okay, but how is it going to work? Where the sight lines are going to be? Who's going to do what then? And then a DJ would say, how do we bring people up and then down? Okay. And then a visual artist would say, what's the tableau going to look like? What's it going to look like? We get one picture, what's it going to look like? And what I started to realize is that artists, and thinking like an artist, because we are all artists inside, no matter whether you're called an artist or not, we all have creativity within us, but tapping into that creativity and tapping into this sort of communication strategy, outreach strategy, works on an affective level, is actually very, very effective. So in other words, affect actually leads to effect. And I think that we need to think about that. One of the things that, if we think about artists, we think about things like choreographers, we think about DJs, we think about painters. But of course, one of the things we do all the time as artists is we tell stories. We just heard 3 stories here, okay? And we know how to tell stories. And a good storyteller helps us identify with whatever the person is who's telling the story. It helps us feel what they've felt. This is something that, people have known for thousands of years. Aristotle wrote about it 2,400 years ago. And Plato hated it. Okay, this is what he really freaked out about. He hated poetry because he thought it would actually move people in dangerous ways to his republic. But even without Plato and Aristotle, people have known the power of stories forever. This is how we pass down knowledge. This is how we bring people into groups. Storytelling is part of we all tell different stories, but it's part of our common cultural heritage, right? And so one of the things we want to think about is the storytelling is a way that everyday people understand how to communicate. It's also a way that we can communicate our abstract facts and figures, which are important, don't get me wrong, but in ways that actually reach everyday people. It's said that the first rule of guerrilla warfare is to know your terrain and use it to your advantage. And we're not talking here about, the jungles of Vietnam or the mountains of Cuba. Today's political landscape is one of signs and symbols and spectacles and stories. And if we're going to operate successfully on that landscape, we need to be really good storytellers. And so with that, I am going to lead it over to today's session, which is going to be led by the storytellers in the room. Thank you very much.